A mysterious parrot enters the hospital room of a baby in a coma. What it does next will leave you speechless. The steady beep of the monitor cut through the silence like a relentless clock, ticking toward an unspoken end. Serena's breath hitched as the sound faltered for a split second, her eyes snapping to the machine. The numbers held steady, but the jolt of panic had already tightened her chest. Her gaze drifted back to Elliot, her baby boy, only 11 months old, so small, so fragile. His tiny hand rested limply against the stark white sheet, unmoving, his once chubby cheeks now pale and hollow. "Please, my love," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the machines. "Fight. Just fight a little more." The room was suffocating. A single dim lamp by the bedside threw long, eerie shadows across the walls of room 205. Outside the cracked window, the humid night pressed against the glass. But Serena barely noticed. Her world had shrunk to the confines of this room, to the rise and fall of her baby's fragile chest, each breath a tenuous thread between hope and despair. The door creaked open, and Caleb stepped inside, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of exhaustion. His shirt clung to his back, damp from the sweltering air outside. In his hand was a crumpled receipt, evidence of yet another loan he had begged for earlier that evening. He placed it on the bedside table with a sigh, not meeting her eyes. "They said no," he muttered. His voice was low, almost apologetic, as if the rejection had been his fault. Serena didn't respond. She didn't need to. The tension between them had grown heavier with every passing day, every mounting bill, every unspoken fear that Elliot might not make it. Caleb dropped into the chair across the room, rubbing his face with his hands. "We've done everything, Val. Sold the car, the jewelry. I even asked Mason. Mason, of all people. And still—" His voice cracked and he stopped, shaking his head. "You think I don't know that?" Serena snapped, her words sharp despite the tremor in her voice. She turned to face him, her eyes red and brimming with tears. "Do you think I don't see you killing yourself out there? Running around begging for scraps while our son—" Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. Caleb leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He wanted to say something, to reassure her, but what was left to say? They had been fighting the same battle for weeks, trapped in this endless cycle of desperation and guilt. Elliot had been their miracle, their answered prayer after years of doctors, treatments, and heartbreak. Serena had cried when she first held him, her fingers tracing his delicate features as if memorizing the face of a dream she never thought would come true. And now, the dream was slipping through their fingers. "They said his condition hasn't changed," Serena finally said, her voice hollow. She kept her gaze on Elliot, unable to look at Caleb. "The doctors, they don't think he'll wake up." Caleb's breath caught, but he forced himself to stay composed. He had to be strong, for her, for Elliot. "They don't know everything," he said firmly. "Elliot's a fighter. He's made it this far, hasn't he?" Serena shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "They said the same thing before the surgery, remember? They said he'd be fine. And look where we are now." Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. Caleb didn't have an answer for that. He stared at the floor, his hands gripping the edge of his knees as if he could steady himself against the crushing weight of their reality. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the monitor. Serena leaned closer to Elliot, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. His skin was cool, his once rosy cheeks now pale and sunken. She closed her eyes, memories flooding back unbidden. Elliot's laughter filling their tiny kitchen, his chubby hands grabbing at her hair as she rocked him to sleep. The way Caleb would light up every time he came home from work and saw Elliot waiting for him at the door, his arms outstretched. "Do you remember his first smile?" Serena asked suddenly, her voice soft, almost wistful. Caleb looked up, surprised by the shift in her tone. "Yeah," he said, his lips twitching into a faint smile. "He smiled at me first, you know. You were so jealous." Serena laughed quietly, the sound tinged with sadness. "I still am," she admitted. The fragile moment of levity was interrupted by a sudden spike in the monitor's beeping. Both of them froze, their eyes darting to the screen. The numbers wavered, then settled again, but the brief fluctuation was enough to send Serena into a panic. "Caleb, get the nurse," she said urgently, her voice trembling. Caleb bolted from the chair, rushing out of the room without a second thought. Serena leaned over Elliot, her heart pounding in her chest. "Please, please, please," she whispered, her hands clutching the bed rail as if her sheer worse in tow. The woman moved quickly, checking the machines, her expression professional but unreadable. "Is he okay? What's happening?" Serena demanded, her voice rising with desperation. The nurse glanced at her, her tone calm but clipped. "He's stable. It might have been a minor fluctuation. Nothing to worry about for now." "For now?" Serena repeated, her voice trembling. The nurse didn't answer, focusing instead on adjusting the monitor. After a few moments, she nodded to herself and stepped back. "I'll be right outside if you need me," she said, before leaving the room. Caleb sank back into the chair, his hands trembling. Serena didn't move, her eyes fixed on Elliot. The fear still lingered in her chest, heavy and suffocating. "He's still here," Caleb said softly, his voice shaking. "That's all that matters, right?" Serena didn't reply. She couldn't. All she could do was sit there, holding on to the fragile hope that the next breath Elliot took wouldn't be his last. Across the room, Serena sat frozen, her eyes fixed on the small, fragile form of her baby boy. Elliot's chest barely moved under the soft glow of the bedside lamp, and Serena's hand hovered over his, torn between touching him and the fear of feeling how lifeless it had become. She bit her lip hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill, her grief like a heavy weight pressing on her chest. Then the silence shattered with an unexpected sound, the faint flutter of wings. It was subtle, barely audible, but enough to jolt Serena out of her thoughts. Her head turned sharply toward the window, where the curtains stirred slightly. She rose from her chair, moving slowly, convinced it must be a bird seeking shelter from the warm summer night. Yet when she peered through the window, she saw only the moonlight blanketing the quiet hospital courtyard below. The hallway outside Elliot's room was equally still, empty except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. She sighed, preparing to sit down again, but something stopped her. A blur of movement streaked across the room, followed by a soft gust of air. Serena's breath caught as she turned just in time to see a vibrant green and yellow parrot glide effortlessly through the open window. It flapped twice, then perched on the headboard of Elliot's crib. Her heart skipped as the bird tilted its head, as though surveying its surroundings with deliberate curiosity. "What in the world?" Serena whispered, taking an instinctive step forward. The parrot's feathers shimmered in the dim light, almost glowing as its black eyes locked on Elliot. It made a strange sound, somewhere between a soft whistle and the faint chime of metal tapping gently. For a moment, Serena thought about shooing it away, worried it might disturb Elliot or even spread germs. But something about the bird's stillness stopped her. Its gaze wasn't random, it was fixed on Elliot in a way that felt almost purposeful. As Serena hesitated, the parrot let out a slow, melodic whistle. And then something impossible happened. The monitor beside Elliot's crib, which had shown nothing but the same steady, monotonous readings for days, flickered. The rhythm of the beeping shifted ever so slightly. Serena's heart raced as she stared at the screen, unsure if she was imagining it. "Is this real?" she muttered, glancing from the monitor to the bird. The parrot hadn't moved, its small body seemingly anchored to the headboard. Its presence was oddly calming, as if it belonged there. Serena's pulse quickened as she fumbled for the call button, summoning a nurse. Before the nurse could arrive, the parrot hopped lightly from the headboard to the edge of Elliot's crib. Serena gasped, a wave of panic surging through her. Don't hurt him," she pleaded softly, her voice trembling. The door opened abruptly, and a nurse stepped in, pushing a medication cart. Her steps faltered as her eyes fell on the brightly colored bird. She froze, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and fascination. "What's going on here?" she asked in a hushed tone, her eyes never leaving the parrot. I don't know," Serena stammered, gesturing toward the monitor. "But look, the readings, they're changing. They've never done that before." The nurse approached cautiously, her gaze darting between the bird and the baby. The parrot stayed perfectly still, as though guarding Elliot. Its presence was unnerving, yet strangely reassuring. And then, with a sudden beat of its wings, the bird soared back toward the window, disappearing into the night as quickly as it had arrived. Serena stood there, stunned. Her hands trembled as she gripped the side of Elliot's crib, her eyes flickering between her baby and the empty window. She couldn't shake the feeling that what had just happened wasn't random. "That couldn't have been a coincidence," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Something about that bird was different, almost otherworldly. She turned back to Elliot. Though he remained still, something in the air had shifted, like a door had cracked open to possibility. For Serena, this wasn't just a bizarre occurrence. It was the beginning of something. She didn't know what yet, but she felt it in her bones. Little did she realize this mysterious visitor would return, and with it, everything she thought she knew about hope and miracles would change. Elliot was Serena and Caleb's firstborn, the child they had longed for through years of heartbreak and disappointment. Serena, a dedicated public school teacher, had poured her love for children into her classroom while enduring painful diagnoses and empty test results. Caleb, a maintenance technician working grueling hours to make ends meet, had shared every hope and fear with her. They had sold what little they had, prayed through endless nights, and endured whispers of pity from friends and family. When Serena finally discovered she was pregnant, it was as though the universe had granted them their deepest wish. Elliot's arrival had been perfect. He was born healthy, with big brown eyes and a smile that seemed to light up the world. For 10 precious months, he had been their miracle. Then, without warning, the nightmare began. A fever that wouldn't break, vomiting that left him weak. Doctors who initially dismissed it as a virus, but soon realized something far worse was at play. The diagnosis had hit like a wrecking ball. A congenital heart defect, undetected until now. Elliot needed urgent surgery to have any chance of survival. Desperate, Serena and Caleb had done what they always did, fought with everything they had. They sold their car, pawned Serena's grandmother's wedding ring, and took on crushing debt to pay for the operation. But even their best wasn't enough. Something had gone wrong in the operating room. Elliot had survived the surgery, but his little body had shut down afterward, slipping into a coma that had stretched into weeks. The surgery was rushed at one of the top hospitals in the area. Serena and Caleb sold their car, pawned their jewelry, and borrowed money wherever they could to cover the staggering costs. But something went horribly wrong during the procedure, and Elliot slipped into a coma. Now, he was trapped in a vegetative state, unresponsive, while his parents could do nothing but watch helplessly as their baby endured his silent struggle. Serena spent her days seated beside his bed, holding his tiny hand and whispering stories as if he could hear her voice. Caleb, meanwhile, moved frantically from one place to another, desperately searching for new ways to keep up with the relentless medical bills. The emotional toll weighed heavily on both of them, yet neither allowed themselves to lose faith in Elliot's recovery. That night, when the parrot first appeared, Serena couldn't shake the thought of it. There was something unusual about that bird. As absurd as it seemed, she felt its presence held a purpose. While the image of its vibrant feathers lingered in her mind, Caleb walked into the room, carrying a takeout bag. "You won't believe what just happened," Serena said, launching into the story about the parrot. Caleb listened intently, his brow furrowing as she spoke, but his skeptical expression didn't waver. "A bird? In the hospital?" Caleb questioned. "It probably just wandered in by accident, Serena. We can't pin our hopes on something so random." Despite Caleb's practical tone, Serena couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something extraordinary about the bird. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, the parrot returned. It flew through the same open window, its green and gold feathers shimmering in the early light, and landed near Elliot's crib. This time, it let out a soft, rhythmic whistle, different from the sound it had made before. A nurse who had been observing from the doorway hurried over to Serena, her face a mixture of curiosity and astonishment. "This is unbelievable," she said, pointing to the monitor. "Elliot's vitals are improving every time that bird shows up." She gestured toward the heart monitor, which displayed slight but consistent stabilization. It was as though the bird's mere presence had a tangible, positive effect on Elliot's fragile condition. Caleb, who had just arrived at the hospital, stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. For a moment, Caleb didn't move, unable to comprehend what he was witnessing. Even though his logical mind resisted, a part of him began to question everything. Determined to figure out what was happening, Caleb started to watch the bird closely. He noticed that it only entered the room during moments of quiet, as if it chose the timing deliberately. Even more puzzling, the bird never seemed to lose its way. It flew straight to Elliot's crib every time, as if it knew exactly where to go. The parrot's visits continued throughout the week, and with each appearance, Elliot showed subtle but undeniable signs of improvement. His heart rate grew steadier, and his breathing deepened just enough to give everyone pause. The medical team, including Dr. Whitaker, the head physician, observed these changes with growing disbelief. "This is just a coincidence," Dr. Whitaker insisted, his voice firm despite the confusion evident on his face. But Serena and Caleb were convinced there was something far greater at work. "He's here for a reason," Serena whispered to Caleb, her eyes following the parrot as it flew out of the window again. Though they didn't fully understand what was happening, they chose to embrace the bird's presence as a symbol of hope. After all, when everything else seemed to be falling apart, it was the unexpected that offered them a fragile thread of faith. On the third day since the parrot's first appearance, the hospital was abuzz with quiet whispers and curiosity. Its presence was beginning to stir something no one could quite explain. Doctors, nurses, and even other patients couldn't stop talking about the mysterious bird. Some dismissed it as just a lost animal, while others whispered about something almost supernatural surrounding its arrival. But for Serena and Caleb, it was far more than an unusual visitor. It was the only thing that still brought a glimmer of purpose to their desperate fight for Elliot's recovery. That morning, as always, the parrot returned, its vibrant feathers flashing as it flew straight to the window of room 205. Serena sat beside Elliot's crib, gently stroking his tiny hand and murmuring a quiet prayer, when the familiar sound of wings made her glance up. The parrot landed with confidence on the crib's railing, its rhythmic chirp filling the room like a faint melody. Serena couldn't hold back the bittersweet smile that formed between her tears. But this time, something was different. Suddenly, the steady beep of Elliot's heart monitor wavered, breaking into an irregular rhythm. The screen, which had shown almost unchanging lines for days, began to display unexpected fluctuations. Serena's heart raced as she called for a nurse, her voice trembling. Within moments, the room was crowded with medical staff. "His vitals are fluctuating," Dr. Whitaker said, his brow furrowed as he studied the charts with quiet intensity. "This could be a good sign, or it could mean complications," he added cautiously. As the doctors adjusted the equipment and ran urgent tests, the parrot remained perched in the room, still and watchful, as if monitoring everything. Attempts to shoo it away were futile. No matter what anyone did, the bird wouldn't budge from Elliot's side. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsettled by the bird's unwavering presence. "Please, let it stay," Serena begged, her voice firm yet pleading. "Since it started coming, my son has shown signs of improvement. You've seen it yourselves." Dr. Whitaker hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. He couldn't explain what was happening, but he also couldn't deny it. That night, Caleb brought a small notebook with him and began jotting down the exact times the parrot appeared, comparing them to Elliot's vital signs. He noticed a pattern. Whenever the bird was in the room, the fluctuations became more pronounced, almost as if there were an unseen link between them. The realization left him both puzzled and cautiously optimistic. Yet that fragile hope was tested the very next day. During another visit from the parrot, Elliot suddenly experienced a severe seizure. The heart monitor blared frantically as alarms echoed through the room. Nurses and doctors rushed in, pushing Serena and Caleb out into the hallway. The couple stood frozen, helpless, as the medical team fought to stabilize their son. Outside, Serena's sobs broke through the tense air as she clung to Caleb's arm. Her body trembled as she whispered, "I knew this could happen, but I can't lose him. Not now." Caleb tried to comfort her, but his own composure was crumbling. His hand rested on her shoulder, his grip steady, but his face pale and drawn. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly until finally Dr. Whitaker stepped into the hallway, his expression grim and unreadable. "He's stable for now," the doctor said, his voice heavy, "but his condition is growing more unpredictable. We have to prepare for any possibility." Serena felt the ground shift beneath her feet, her legs weak, as if they might give out. Despite the small glimmers of progress Elliot had shown, this crisis reminded her how precarious his situation remained. He was still in a coma, and the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. Even so, she knew she couldn't give up. That night, as Elliot lay motionless, the parrot returned. But this time its behavior changed. It didn't just chirp. It began producing sounds that resembled fragmented words. Serena's eyes widened as she leaned closer, her heart pounding with a mix of awe and confusion. Among the bird's disjointed noises, she thought she heard something like fight. She couldn't be sure, but it reignited her resolve. Watching silently, Caleb made a decision. He picked up his phone, aimed the camera at the parrot, and pressed record. If this bird is doing something, if it's part of why Elliot's still fighting, we need to have proof, Caleb said quietly, his voice thick with determination. If there's something special about this parrot, we need to figure out what it is, Caleb said quietly. The couple spent the entire night wide awake, their eyes shifting between Elliot and the peculiar bird. As the first rays of sunlight crept into the room, Serena turned to Caleb, her voice tinged with both uncertainty and conviction. I feel like it's trying to tell us something. Maybe it's showing us a way forward. Little did they know, this was just the beginning. Elliot would face even more life-threatening crises, and the parrot would continue to defy reason with its cryptic presence. Amid the turmoil, something would emerge that could change everything, leading to a climax neither of them could have anticipated. The following week was a roller coaster of emotions for Serena and Caleb. Elliot remained in a critical state, yet each time the parrot appeared, his vital signs showed subtle but undeniable improvements. It was enough to spark hope in the couple, even if they couldn't fully understand what was happening. However, the doctors held firmly to their skepticism, attributing the fluctuations in Elliot's condition to the natural instability of his fragile state. Still, the whispers about the mysterious bird began spreading quietly among the hospital staff. That night, as the clock inched closer to midnight, the hospital was unusually quiet, its typically busy hallways now eerily still. Serena dozed fitfully in the chair beside Elliot's bed, her head tilted at an awkward angle, while Caleb hunched over the small table in the corner, scribbling more notes about the bird's behavior. The familiar sound of wings slicing through the air broke the silence, drawing Caleb's attention. As if rehearsed, the parrot glided into the room through the open window, landing lightly on the windowsill. This time, however, something felt different. The bird didn't fly directly to Elliot's crib, as it usually did. Instead, it lingered at the window, its piercing gaze fixed on Caleb, its posture deliberate, almost purposeful. It let out a sharp cry, high-pitched and startling, nothing like the melodic tones it had produced before. Caleb stood abruptly, startled, and instinctively stepped toward the bird. "It's trying to tell us something," he murmured, more to himself than to Serena, who had stirred awake and was now watching the scene with rapt attention. Without warning, the parrot flew to Elliot's crib and perched near the heart monitor. The machine began to beep erratically, the steady rhythm breaking into chaotic bursts. Serena rushed to the screen, her heart pounding, her hands fumbling to interpret the data displayed. Her breath caught as her eyes widened. Elliot's heart was beating faster than it had since he fell into the coma. It was impossible, at least according to the doctors. And then, the unimaginable happened. Elliot's tiny right hand moved, the faintest twitch, but enough to send Serena reeling. She clasped her hands over her mouth, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "He moved!" she cried, her voice breaking with a mix of disbelief and joy. Caleb stood frozen, his wide eyes locked on his son. The parrot let out a triumphant sound, something between a whistle and a celebratory song, its vibrant energy filling the room like an unspoken proclamation of victory. But the elation was short-lived. The monitor suddenly erupted into a shrill, deafening alarm. Elliot's fragile body convulsed as another crisis took hold. Nurses and doctors poured into the room, quickly ushering Serena and Caleb out into the hallway. Inside, chaos erupted. The parrot flew to a high corner of the room, its sharp eyes fixed on the frantic efforts to stabilize Elliot. "We need to bring him back now," Dr. Whitaker's voice rang out, commanding but tense as he adjusted the equipment. His team worked with urgency, their movements precise but desperate. In the hallway, Serena clutched the crucifix around her neck, her lips moving silently in prayer. Caleb paced back and forth, his hands raking through his hair as he fought the rising tide of hopelessness threatening to overwhelm him. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and Dr. Whitaker stepped out. His face was composed, but his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. "He's stable again," he said at last, "but this was the worst crisis he's faced so far." Serena exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "And now? What does this mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Whitaker hesitated, then answered quietly, "It means he's fighting. His heart is responding, but this doesn't guarantee anything. He's still very fragile." That night, as the tension in the room eased, something even more extraordinary took place. The parrot, still perched in the corner where it had been watching, suddenly descended, landing softly on Elliot's tiny chest. The bird began to hum low, delicate notes, almost like a lullaby drifting through the still air. Amazingly, Elliot's vitals began to steady. The monitors showed a calming rhythm, the frantic spikes evening out into something almost normal. What happened next defied all explanation. Elliot's eyes fluttered open, the first time they had done so since he had fallen into the coma. It lasted only a moment, but it was long enough for Serena to notice. Caleb's eyes went wide, his voice breaking into a shout. "He's awake!" He rushed to Elliot's side, his steps trembling, and together they watched as their baby boy moved his head ever so slightly. The parrot didn't flinch. It remained motionless, standing watch over the baby as though shielding him. When Elliot's eyelids gently closed again, the bird leapt into the air, flying to the open window. With one final sweep of its wings, it disappeared into the darkness outside. Doctors rushed in at once, called by the commotion. They surrounded Elliot, examining the equipment, their faces painted with disbelief. "This shouldn't be possible," Dr. Whitaker murmured, his brow furrowed as he studied the child. "There's no scientific reason for this." But Serena didn't care for explanations. She didn't need one. That brief moment had been all she needed, a sign that Elliot was returning to them. While the hospital staff tried to make sense of what had just transpired, Serena and Caleb experienced something they hadn't felt in weeks: hope. They knew Elliot's fight wasn't over, but they could feel something shifting. And the parrot? It was gone, but they were certain it would come back. Somehow, it always seemed to show up exactly when Elliot needed it most. Maybe next time it would bring even more answers to the mystery that no one could yet solve. By morning, the hospital was abuzz. Word of Elliot and the strange bird had spread among the staff, patients, and even into local news outlets. Everyone wanted to know more about the peculiar parrot that appeared to be linked to the baby's miraculous recovery. Serena and Caleb, however, remained focused on what mattered most. Elliot was improving. His small, fragile body was beginning to show signs of strength again. Dr. Whitaker gathered his team in Elliot's room later that day, skepticism etched into his features, though there was also a glimmer of curiosity in his eyes. "The latest scans show increased brain activity," he announced, unable to hide the astonishment in his tone. "He's still in a delicate state, but the progress we're seeing, it's something I truly can't explain." Serena clutched Elliot's tiny hand, listening intently. She looked up, her voice firm with conviction. "The parrot did this," she said. "It brought something healing, something powerful. I can't explain it, but I feel it in my heart." Whitaker sighed, a mix of frustration and wonder in his expression. "Serena, I understand your faith, but we have to focus on science." "And what does science say about his vitals improving every time the bird appears?" Caleb challenged, his voice steady. "You have the data. You can't ignore it." Whitaker didn't respond immediately, but the crease in his forehead deepened. Something about this situation unsettled him, though he wouldn't admit it outright. Meanwhile, Serena noticed something remarkable. Elliot was responding more often. His tiny fingers twitched, his breathing grew steadier, and in a particularly moving moment, his eyes opened once more. This time, they locked onto hers, as if recognizing the voice that had spoken to him every single day. Tears streamed down Serena's face as she turned to Caleb, pulling him into a tight embrace. Later that afternoon, the parrot returned. Just as before, it flew through the open window, its bright feathers glowing in the sunlight. This time, however, it carried something in its beak, a single blue feather. The bird landed beside Elliot, gently dropping the feather onto his chest. Then it began to sing again, but this melody was different. It was deeper, more resonant, with an almost electrifying intensity. What happened next was beyond extraordinary. Elliot's vitals didn't just stabilize, they surged with strength. His eyes opened again, wide and bright, and for the first time he looked directly at his mother and let out a faint sound, as though trying to speak. Serena nearly collapsed to her knees. "My baby, you're here," Serena exclaimed, tears streaming down her face. The parrot lingered in the room for several minutes, its sharp, gleaming eyes observing everything with a curious intensity. When the doctors arrived to check on Elliot, the bird flapped its wings and flew toward the open window. But it didn't leave right away. It perched on the windowsill, staring at Serena and Caleb as if trying to convey something profound. Then, with one final whistle, it vanished into the sky. The days that followed were marked by a recovery that seemed nothing short of miraculous. Though Elliot was still frail, he began to move, make faint sounds, and even attempt to crawl in short bursts. The doctors were stunned. Dr. Whitaker, who had initially dismissed any connection between the parrot and the baby's improvement, finally admitted, "This is something I simply cannot explain. Maybe there are things in this world that science will never fully understand." But the deepest transformation wasn't found in the medical charts, it was in the hearts of Serena and Caleb. They believed the parrot wasn't just a random visitor, but had been sent by something far greater, a messenger of hope. Determined to share their story, not to seek explanations but to inspire others, the couple spoke openly about what had happened. They wanted people to remember that even in the darkest moments, it's essential to hold on to faith. 1 week later, as they strolled through the hospital gardens with Elliot bundled in a stroller, Serena and Caleb heard a familiar sound. Looking up, they saw the parrot circling above them, its wings shimmering in the golden sunlight. The bird swooped low, making a graceful loop over their heads before disappearing once again. Serena smiled softly and whispered, "Thank you for everything." From that day forward, Elliot became known as the Miracle Baby, and the parrot was regarded as a symbol of hope and resilience. What many would have dismissed as an ordinary bird had proven to the world that miracles often come from the least expected places. Serena and Caleb learned that the struggle was worth it, and that even in the face of despair, love and faith could change everything. After all, it was the unexpected presence of a simple parrot that taught them to believe in the impossible and to never give up. Wow, what an incredible story, right? Even though it's not real, it carries so much meaning and gives us so much to think about. Elliot's journey and the mysterious parrot may be fictional, but they beautifully highlight some of life's most important lessons: the power of hope, the strength of love, and the belief in something greater than ourselves. Think about it. How often do we find ourselves in situations that feel hopeless, where everything seems like it's falling apart? This story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, we can find light in the most unexpected places. Whether it's through a person, an event, or even a symbol like the parrot, sometimes life gives us little signs to hold on just a little longer. At its core, this story is about resilience. Serena and Caleb's unwavering faith in their son and their fight to stay hopeful shows us that love is a powerful force. It doesn't promise easy answers, but it does keep us moving forward even when the odds are stacked against us. And isn't that what we all need? A reminder that even when we're at our lowest, there's always a chance for change, for miracles, no matter how small they may seem. So what do you think? Do you believe that hope and love can truly make a difference even in the toughest times? Or do you think this story just serves as a symbolic way of inspiring people? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below, share your perspective, or tell me about a time when you found hope in an unexpected place. Thanks for sticking around, my friends, and I can't wait to hear your stories. Until next time, take care and stay hopeful.